On the very rare occasion, some of the world's leading and most bewildering mysteries finally find their long-awaited answers. The solutions to these decade-long enigmas are often more unsettling than the mysteries themselves, though. Imagine being out in the middle of the ocean on a small boat as fragile as a sailing yacht. Then imagine being surrounded by a group of orcas, ranging anywhere from 10 to 100 in number, that measure just about the same length as that vessel. Since 2020, this is exactly what's been happening all over the world. Humans venture into the big blue bit on their man-made machines that are unknown to marine mammals, only to find some pretty frightening interactions. Between 2020 and 2024, there have been 500 reported incidents of orcas interacting with boats in the Atlantic. Those interactions are often aggressive and unprecedented. There have been various isolated incidents where these known to be aggressive whales have targeted yachts and other small vessels. This scary scenario has gained worldwide notoriety and even led to the orca memes that circulate on social media, often citing the Eat the Rich movement. The most notable of boat attacks came from a small group of just 3 orcas off the coast of Spain. The trio had attacked a boat in the Strait of Gibraltar, damaging it so badly that it sank. Headlines such as "Killer Whale Gang Sinks Another Yacht" became the norm, but concerns continued to grow, eventually leading to vessels being banned in certain open water areas. In 2023, a pod of 35 whales living off the Iberian Peninsula were responsible for another 23 boat attacks. They'd repeatedly rammed into a yacht, damaging it enough for the crew to require rescuing. When the Atlantic Orca Working Group investigated this report, they revealed that just 3 years prior, this pod had been registered on 52 such events. This increased to 197 in 2021, and then to 207 in 2022. Oddly, there have been no reports of orcas attacking swimmers. Biologist Alfredo Lopez of the University of Aveiro claimed that the incidents were rare, and that in videos of such attacks the orcas didn't display an aggressive nature, but instead appeared calm. These strange, seemingly unprovoked attacks leave many puzzled and in search of an answer. No one could figure out why the marine mammals were suddenly targeting the watercraft. Researchers eventually formed 2 hypotheses, particularly for the Iberian whales. One theory suggested that the orcas had invented a new fad, which they were known to do, and the others that they may have had a bad experience with such vessels in the past, leading them to attack the boats in an effort to protect themselves and the pod. It was also believed that the orcas may have been trying to play, or may have been the victims of traumatic injury that they sustained from such a vessel. When biologists and other experts in the field began investigating further into this strange mystery that left people wondering why the whales were exhibiting such behavior, they discovered that pretty much all the theories were the truth. The International Whaling Commission released a report detailing that the orcas were actually just having fun, but this came in combination with a few other things that all happened at once. Following preservation efforts, the bluefin tuna population in the strait began to rise, bringing a resurgence of whales. With more whales and more people, more interactions came. While on the hunt for food, the whales found themselves with free time, curiosity, and natural playfulness, a recipe for a rather unique, damaging, and scary phenomenon. Since 1993, German, Austrian, and French law enforcement have faced a serious problem. There was a woman who was moving between the countries committing a series of crimes. These included petty theft, burglaries, and daunting homicides. They had her DNA at 40 crime scenes, 6 of which were heinous homicides. But the maniac was unknown to the forces, leaving the crimes unsolved and running cold. She'd seemingly slipped through their grasp, evading eyewitnesses and leaving behind no other traces that may identify her. The suspect was subsequently named the Phantom of Heilbronn and the Woman Without a Face. Police were left dumbfounded by how these crimes were being committed. They would occur over vast distances, sometimes just weeks apart. How was she getting to each place so quickly, and who was she? It all began with the passing of a woman in 1993. She'd been the victim of strangulation with DNA pointing to an unknown suspect. 8 years later, the same DNA was found on the kitchen cupboard door in the home of a 61-year-old homicide victim in Germany. That same year, more than 100 kilometers away, the DNA popped up again, this time on a cookie jar after a break-in. Then a policewoman had her life taken in Heilbronn, and where the DNA was found yet again. For the next 16 years, a slew of crimes would follow, all of which were being committed by the same person over a vast expanse. Genetic testing pointed to a suspect of Eastern European descent. Cracking the case seemed like an impossible task. To make it even more difficult, the only eyewitness accounts in these cases described the suspect as male. In a bizarre twist, DNA found on the burnt body of a Middle Eastern asylum seeker who had disappeared in 2002 also matched the same DNA of the phantom. This led to even more questions about the suspect's true identity. They were dealing with a criminal mastermind. An investigation ensued over the years, and it became clear that there may have been something else at play here. The evidence suggested the idea of contamination, butchering the investigation and forcing detectives to take a different approach, turning the focus on themselves. Law enforcement had been looking everywhere, when really they should have been looking at their own forensic analysis. In 2009, a revelation was made, and the culprit was unmasked. The slayer was finally traced to a factory in Austria. The woman without a face was working in a plant that made cotton swabs. The same cotton swabs were used by the police for DNA. The discovery proved that the Phantom of Heilbronn didn't exist, and it was all a figment of the imagination, plaguing the minds of law enforcement through faulty DNA samples and contaminated items. The factory worker was innocent. She hadn't been traveling the area committing various criminal acts. It was all an embarrassing misunderstanding. The factory producing these cotton swabs later clarified that their products were for medical purposes and were not qualified for DNA testing. While the swabs were disinfected before leaving the factory, the method didn't get rid of 100% of DNA traces. This revelation left all the DNA obtained at 40 crime scenes useless. Each case had already been attributed to the Phantom, but following this discovery, they're now left unsolved and stacked up with the rest of the cold cases. On the 28th of October, 1943, Carl Meredith Allen witnessed something truly bizarre that he would later tell the UFO theorist Morris K. Jessup about. Allen had seen the USS Eldridge, a U.S. Navy escort that served during the Second World War, seemingly disappear off of the port of Philadelphia. Allen believed that he had just witnessed the unified field theory in action, an unproven hypothesis that blends the theory of relativity and electromagnetism. But he wasn't the only one who witnessed this strange event. Other witnesses would later recount what they had seen that day. The Eldridge had just departed from the port and developed a strange green light that entombed it. The vessel then blinked from existence, appeared at the Norfolk Naval Yard, and then blinked back to the Philadelphia port as though it had never left. Strangely, those who were on board claimed to have been suffering from a mysterious illness or insanity. Rumors also circulated that some of them even became fused to the metal. Claims of secret government experiments abound, alleging that they planned to make ships invisible to the enemy. It turned out, though, that the vessel was, in fact, carrying some top-secret cargo. It was equipment used to scramble the magnetic waves of the vessel, leaving it untraceable to enemies. But the idea that the ship had disappeared, appeared just more than 5 hours away, and then reappeared back at the port just seemed way too outlandish and incomprehensible. The years pressed on as many continued to wonder about the alarming event of the disappearing act, with theories of teleportation, aliens, and invisibility cloaks doing the rounds. But with the years, there came new developments, revelations, and understanding in science, ultimately allowing the many year-long mysteries to finally be put to rest. The disappearance of the USS Eldridge had a scientific explanation, which was all attributed to a short channel and weather phenomenon. Scientists believe that the alleged green glow that witnesses claim to have seen surrounding the vessel was created by an electrical storm or the phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. This weather phenomenon refers to the continuous electric spark that occurs when the atmosphere has been charged. This then causes a discharge of plasma between the objects and the air. Experts have discovered that St. Elmo's fire, in the act, allows luminous plasma to form around rod-like objects, such as the ship's mast. This weather phenomenon, paired with the short channel that the ships traveled through, connecting both Norfolk and Philadelphia, led to the illusion that the USS Eldridge had momentarily vanished. In 2014, hundreds of people began to flock to southern Belgium. They'd received word of a creepy ordeal that was happening in the quiet town of Jalhay. It was the statue of the Virgin Mary, and she was glowing. The phenomenon had first been noticed in mid-January of that year and began to attract ever-growing crowds. It didn't take long for local media to start reporting on this incident, claiming that the mysteriously glowing Madonna had healed a local skin condition. The 1-foot-tall figure is a representation of the Virgin of Banu, inspired by a nearby village where a girl had reportedly seen an apparition of Mary, making the town a pilgrimage destination. Catholic authorities have asserted that there is certainly something going on, but that everyone should proceed with caution regarding this eerie glowing statuette. Investigators also arrived in Jalhay to use their expertise to determine why the Virgin was glowing green. The problem was that the carving was standing in a private house and was privately owned by a man who refused to allow her to be taken away from where she stood. The owner stated she's fine where she is, allowing an eerie mystery to press on, only gathering more attention. In one day alone, more than 500 people visited the residence to witness the dull glow for themselves. Initially skeptical of the claims, some were left dumbfounded when they discovered that the Virgin really was emanating an inexplicable glow. One investigator took a trip to Belgium to investigate the alleged miracle. He'd witnessed something similar before, on 2 separate occasions. The first was in 2003, when the investigator was in a church's bell tower in Campbell, Ohio. On either side of the tower were religious statues, both of which were claimed to have emitted a strange glow. Upon investigating the effigies, though, it was discovered that only the halos, gilded eyes, and sacred hearts were shining, and this was because the sunlight was hitting them at the perfect angle, and at night the street lights would do the same job. The other case took place in Belgium, where the shadow of the cross painting would glow in the dark. Once the room was rid of all light, the painting's background glowed as if it were in moonlight. While he couldn't directly test the painting for chemicals, the investigator believed that it had been painted with glow-in-the-dark paint. Upon witnessing the glow of the Madonna in the once quiet town, the investigator added the phenomenon to his list of things to figure out. But another research team beat him to it. A scientific group was sent to investigate the so-called miracle. It was led by Dr. Rudy Kutz, who was able to determine the real cause of the glow. The phosphorescence was caused by a coating that was painted over the Madonna. It contained zinc sulfide, a compound used as a pigment and as a phosphor. The glowing statue was painted with glow-in-the-dark paint. It was July of 1996 when an act of violence shook Oklahoma. It was that year that the United States hosted the Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia, which saw many people flock to the Centennial Olympic Park. As they were gathered there, a 911 call threatened an utter catastrophe. The caller revealed that an explosive had been placed in the park where hundreds of people had just gathered, with more on their way. The anonymous caller told them exactly when the device would detonate, and they needed to think quickly to try to stop it. A security guard at the event, Richard Jewell, was informed of the impending doom and quickly sprang into action. He managed to locate a backpack that held the weapon inside and promptly alerted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the evacuation procedures began. But the device had gone off before it was intended to. This led law enforcement to believe that the explosion was meant for the officers who descended onto the park. But thanks to the heroic efforts of Jewell, many lives were saved, limiting casualties to one person who sustained fatal injuries due to the blast, and another who had a heart attack following the event. Despite Jewell being dubbed a hero, the FBI quickly turned their suspicion on him, naming him the suspect behind the attack. He was placed under investigation for the crime, but the evidence against him was lacking, and he was cleared of any involvement by October of that year. This disqualification of a suspect left law enforcement empty-handed. They had no leads and no clues as to who may have been behind this potentially catastrophic act. In January of the following year, another intentional explosion occurred outside of a clinic in suburban Atlanta. This left a hole in the side of a building, forcing ambulances and police officers to flock to the area. An hour later, a second blast went off while the emergency personnel were still on the scene. 7 people were injured this time around, and again the authorities were the target. Just 5 days later, another explosive of the same type went off near the patio of a nightclub, injuring 5 people. Once authorities were on the scene, they immediately began searching for the second explosive. They found it in a backpack and were able to detonate it safely. The FBI was able to link all the incidents, since each had followed the same pattern and made use of the same type of explosive, but still they had no suspect. The next year, on the 29th of January, another clinic was reduced to rubble in Birmingham, Alabama. This took the life of an off-duty cop as well as wounded a nurse, but the criminal this time had made a crucial mistake. His vehicle had been spotted near the crime scene and was later found abandoned near the Georgia state line. Following this discovery, investigators were able to trace it to a 31-year-old carpenter named Eric Robert Rudolph, who was able to evade arrest. Despite not being found immediately, authorities positively identified him as the criminal behind the Birmingham and Centennial Olympic Park explosions, and the manhunt began. Rudolph was able to evade capture by withdrawing into the mountains of western North Carolina. He was subsequently placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list until finally being apprehended in 2003. He was arrested by a police officer named J.S. Postel while he was rummaging through the garbage behind a grocery store in Murphy, North Carolina. In an effort to avoid capital punishment, Rudolph entered a plea agreement and pled guilty to the 3 incidents, as well as the homicide of a police officer. On the 18th of July in 2005, he was sentenced to multiple life sentences without parole. Weeping statues, an enduring phenomenon of the churches, often seen in movies or on the news, are being boasted as a miracle. Inanimate objects allowing a tear to trickle is weird on its own, but when that liquid is red, the mystery becomes a whole lot creepier. Every year, news of crying statues make the headlines, attracting thousands of miracle seekers who are in search of evidence of the divine. Many find peace, consolation, and restoration in such events, while others just find it really strange and terrifying. Often, the tears that seemingly fall from the eyes of the statues are attributed to supernatural means. Some cry vital fluid, scented liquids, or regular water, allowing them to garner worldwide attention, leaving an enduring mystery in their wake. Many of these statues are found in churches or at the shrines of private homes. In recent years, when such miracles came into question, the church has been authorized to carry out an investigation to determine if the event is something of divine origin, a result of nature, or a hoax created for personal attention. Generally, the local bishop will initiate such investigations, often led by experts and scientists. The team is responsible for ruling out possible causes to secure the idea that the weeping statue is a miracle. During these investigations, samples of the alleged tears are collected and tested. X-ray means are also used to rule out any internal mechanism that may have fraudulently been placed within the statue. These investigations so far have yielded some unfavorable results. Often there's no supernatural force at play with these creepy carvings. Instead, it's been found that the water drops are actually natural condensation, sometimes even droplets from leaking ductwork. Some cases have been proven to be hoaxes, where miracle makers make use of pig's fat to make it appear as though the inanimate object is crying. The most controversial of those cases was in 1995, referring to the Virgin Mary statue in Italy. Here, 60 churchgoers claimed to have seen vital fluid run from the eyes of the statue on at least 14 different occasions. Upon testing, though, that fluid was found to be of male origin. Conveniently, the owner of the carving, Fabio Gregori refused a DNA test. In 2002, a similar event took place in Italy, but the fluid was found to belong to a local woman. In 2008, a custodian was placed on trial for also faking the tears of a Virgin Mary statue, where his DNA matched the droplets. Often, the reason behind these hoaxes is to bring more believers into the community and even restore faith into existing followers. But it's arguable that the most creepy thing about the weeping statues is that people are using their own vital fluid to create these false miracles. The most recently documented weeping statue came about in 2018 in New Mexico. It was here that a community claimed that the statue had been weeping, which was supposedly seen by many witnesses during a noon mass. This brought a crowd of people to the area in search of conversion and confession, or just to see it happen. But following expert analysis, it was found that the substance was really just oil mixed with perfume. Back in April of 2013, an unsettling image taken from Google Maps took social media by storm. Redditors had cited specific coordinates that may lead to a haunting scene in Almere, Netherlands. In a park was an octagonal dock, which seemed to be the host of a chilling narrative. The story spread like wildfire, with people claiming to have seen an image that showed a figure dragging a lifeless body into the murky depths of the surrounding lake. Social media users across the world zoomed in on their phones, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing and wondering what other dark secrets that body of water may be holding. At first glance, the image sends chills down spines. It's an alarming sight, one that needs to be investigated. A darkened fluid can be seen dragging along the pier, only to pool up just off the center of the dock. To one side there stands a man, and another figure, frozen in place over what appears to be a body. Imaginations ran rampant, making the story far more sinister than what actually took place here. When considering all the logical elements of the image, this eerie narrative soon falls away. For one, it's broad daylight in a public park bustling with life. It would seem much too impossible for the supposed slayer to be lurking about in plain sight and dragging the weight of a person along the pier unnoticed when leaving a trail of evidence in his wake. He would also need to lift the lifeless body a few feet off the ground if he were to toss it off the dock's edge and allow it to sink into the depths of the water. Despite these logical points in place, many questions still abound. What really happened here? What's been done about it? And who else could have witnessed the chilling act? In 2013, 5 long years after the eerie image had circulated, police were dispatched to the site. By then, all traces of the truth had been swallowed. With the absence of evidence, it seemed as though the mystery would never be solved. It wasn't until some time later that one of the figures who was on the dock that day got word of this haunting story. Upon investigating the strange narrative, they discovered that it was all just a big misunderstanding. The figure was determined to put this 5-year-long mystery to rest. While the idea of a homicide was intriguing, the individual found comedy in it all. The humor stemmed only from the truth of what really happened on the dock that day. What the satellite captured was not a homicide scene at all, but rather it was a very wet dog who had jumped into the lake and run around on the dock, leaving behind an alarming scene. It was 2007 when something incredibly strange came to light through Google Maps. It was centered around a lake that lies just outside of Iraq's Sadr city. It was a bright red splat that ominously lingered on the land. The crimson hue had sparked a wave of macabre speculation, and theories began to run rampant. This wasn't the first instance of unnaturally red water that had not only been stirring interest, but also instilling fear. Similar occurrences have been recorded globally, and each of the stories had its time in the light, leaving locals and anyone who hears of them feeling a sinister feeling. Lago Vermelho, once a green-blue hue, had turned a startling scarlet color, drawing frightened attention as it spread across social media platforms. Theories spoke of grotesque slaughterhouse waste to suggestions of bodies being dumped in the lake, but the spine-chilling mystery actually had more of a mundane truth. The revelations turned out to not be so horrific after all. It wasn't until a similar incident was recorded in Iran, affecting Lake Urmia, that the mystery would finally be solved. Lake Urmia was once a deep green color, and within a short period of time, it had morphed into an alarming red-stained hue. The same theories echoed about Urmia too, each hinting at something more violent and horrifying. Simple investigations, though, were underway and yielded some less gory reasons for transformation. At the time, there was a drought wreaking havoc in Iran. The demand for more water was at an all-time high, ultimately shrinking the expansive body of water. As the water reduced, the salinity levels increased, all of which was a cocktail for life to flourish, as it became the perfect breeding ground for a specific algae. The algae, combined with the salt-loving bacteria, ultimately turned the water red. The salt-loving organisms had adopted a red pigment that allows them to absorb sunlight and convert it to energy, ultimately letting off a crimson color, fooling everyone into thinking that the water was contaminated with vital fluid. It was found 200 years ago, peering out from a flower bed in Chichester. There were indentations where the eyes should be, a bulge for a nose and mouth. It looked like an unfinished bust. The incompletion gave the Bosham Head quite the unique appearance, one that was sure to be instilled in nightmares. It was theorized, though, that the bust was once complete with all features intact, but became badly eroded over time, diminishing the prominent features, resulting in a strange-looking amorphous face. Since its discovery, the creepy, massive stone object has remained an enduring mystery. Many wondered who made it and who the bust was supposed to be representing. Questions abound about how it ended up in the flower bed of a Bosham garden in the 1800s in the first place. For over 2 centuries, the residents of a small district on the south side of England have been left puzzled by the head. As the bust continued to erode, it was moved to the ground floor of the Chichester District Museum, where it was cemented in place. Here, the piece would remain unidentified and forgotten until the lonely head finally caught a break and was transferred to the Novium Museum. Every archaeological discovery is an important one. Each artifact serves as a window into ancient times, so figuring out the mystery behind this bodiless bust was absolutely crucial. The move to a new home ultimately put an enduring mystery to rest when the bust caught the eyes of archaeologists from Bournemouth University. Dr. Miles Russell and Harry Manley headed the newfound interest and investigation into the mysterious artifact. The pair made use of the latest 3D laser scanning technology, allowing them to examine the 176-kilogram object. The examination revealed that the Bosham Head came from AD 122, and it once belonged to the statue of the Roman Emperor Trajan. Trajan was remembered as the second of the 5 good emperors of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. He was said to be a philanthropic ruler and a successful soldier who oversaw the greatest military explorations in Roman history. The dynasty under his rule saw many changes. He'd spearheaded a public works program that saw new bridges, harbors, and aqueducts. He also reduced taxes and even allowed the less fortunate citizens to acquire free grain. According to Russell, the structure was made from Italian marble, and he believes that it would be the most impressive sculpture if it wasn't so eroded. This is an important discovery for Roman Britain, and the most impressive. The statue is one of the largest to have ever been found in Britain. The 3D scans were able to render a distinctive hairstyle and some other facial features, but even the scans leave the Bosham Head looking like a terrifying face. It was the 4th of April in 1943. Lady Be Good, a military aircraft of the 514th Squadron, was stationed in Soluch Field, Libya. On this day, 9 crew members arrived in the country. Their first ever assignment would be to join a squadron of over 20 planes to attack the harbor of Naples, Italy. Following this mission, the planes were due back at their base, located in North Africa. Little did anyone know that Lady Be Good's departure would spark off one of the most enduring mysteries that lasted a lengthy 15 years. On that day, the aircraft and crew were last to leave the base and were immediately faced with high winds and reduced visibility from a sudden sandstorm. Despite these poor conditions, the squadron headed for Naples nonetheless, not allowing something as simple as the weather to prevent them from doing what they came there to do. The plane luckily made it to Naples, but by this time it was dark, and the aircraft had already suffered various technical issues. Upon their arrival there, the crew decided that it would be best to head back to Libya, and Lieutenant William J. Hatton radioed the airfield. At around 12 a.m., he informed the base that the plane's automatic direction finder was not working. The base decided to fire up the flares to signal the location to where to land. Lady Be Good, though, never arrived there, and a rescue team was subsequently deployed. But the military craft and its crew were nowhere to be found. They were simply lost in the abyss, somewhere over the Mediterranean Sea. By the end of the Second World War, the whereabouts of Lady Be Good still remained a mystery. Its crew never turned up, and despite extensive investigations, no debris was ever found. The story of the missing plane was not a unique one. Many aircraft had gone missing before, especially during the war, never to be seen again. The difference with the enigmatic disappearance of this aircraft was that its mystery was eventually solved, although only 15 years later. For those 15 years, no one had ever known what had happened to the plane or its 9 crew members. It wasn't until November of 1958 that the mystery could finally be put to rest, following a discovery made by British geologists. They'd been flying over the Libyan desert when they spotted some debris. It looked like a crashed plane, so they contacted the Wheelus Air Force Base. At the time, though, Wheelus had no record of a missing American plane in the area, so they didn't immediately react to this call. During subsequent surveys, the geologists continued to spot the downed craft, and eventually they dispatched a ground team to investigate the site. The wreck was Lady Be Good, and it was still very much intact and surprisingly preserved. But there was no sign of the missing crew, aside from some clothing that had been left behind, allowing searchers to identify who was on board. This information prompted an investigation by the Wheelus Air Force Base, which sent out officials from both the base and the Army Quartermaster Mortuary. Investigations into the site began in May of 1959, ending in August of that same year, finally allowing the story of the vanishing aircraft to be told. During the efforts, officials were able to find artifacts, equipment, parachutes, and flight boots, but the remains of the crew were lost. The search for the missing man began to scale back as equipment began to deteriorate. Despite thorough searches, it seemed as though the crew were nowhere to be found, and just like that, the case of Lady Be Good didn't seem to close after all. 6 months after the investigation had come to an end, another search was prompted by the officials, this time in just a matter of a few days. They came across the remains of 5 crew members who were located just miles from the site. After locating 5 of the 9 airmen, the military made another effort to find the remaining 4. The final search was dubbed Operation Climax, which saw a joint search by the Army and Air Force. This ultimately led to another 2 discoveries. By the end of May 1960, there were still 2 Lady Be Good crew members missing. British Petroleum was also responsible for searching for the missing men, and they managed to find another. All crew members were found, aside from Sergeant Vernon Moore, who still remains missing today. With all of the evidence at hand, the military was able to piece together the final moments of the aircraft and its crew. After overshooting their planned destination, Lady Be Good had run out of fuel. It was dark, and it was the crew's first mission. Low fuel, darkness, and inexperience were a recipe for absolute disaster. It appeared that instead of attempting to land the plane, all 9 men decided to bail from the in-flight aircraft. 8 of them survived the jump. With only half a canteen of water, they decided to head out into the desert, where some of them became too exhausted to carry on, perishing where they stood, and others furthered their journey in search of aid, eventually succumbing to the harsh elements. On January 11, 1980, at about 5 p.m., Mark Madger returned to his apartment in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, to find his son, Daniel, in the playpen as usual. His wife, Nadine, however, was on the floor and no longer alive. A crime scene investigator later found in her body over 40 holes made by a blade from the kitchen. For lack of evidence, the true story behind this unsolved crime case would not be solved until decades later. A forensic investigation soon determined that the criminal responsible had taken Nadine's life between 1:15 and 4:45 in the afternoon. A neighbor told detectives they remembered seeing an out-of-place yellow car in the driveway at about 1 p.m., but did not recognize the driver. DNA technology had not advanced enough to provide a suspect, and with no further leads, the case went cold until years later. In 1996, 16 years after the crime, forensic investigators re-examined the clothing she was wearing during her final moments alive. Much to their surprise, forensic science revealed the red stains came from two different people, some from Nadine and some from the criminal while she defended herself. This evidence was filed away for years before the case was finally solved. In 2018, the clothing was taken out of the cold case files yet again for a deeper analysis. This time, investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs Incorporated, a DNA forensic company in Virginia, to use the forensic technique called phenotyping. This special forensic technique determines specific genetic traits based on a criminal's DNA sample. Law enforcement now knew that they were looking for a male of Eastern European descent with blonde hair and blue eyes. Next, the DNA was submitted to two large databases until a potential match was found. Investigators found the distant cousins of the suspect and kept tracing the family lineage. The percentage of matching DNA kept going higher and higher until they reached direct relatives of a man named Joseph Simcak. At the time, Joseph had two jobs that would have placed him near the residence of Mark and Nadine Madger. When investigators found records of a yellow car matching the description given by witnesses on the day of the crime, they began to dig into all of his personal files. On the day Nadine lost her life, Joseph had coincidentally called out sick for the second shift of his job at the Lincoln Electric manufacturing plant. It was a highly unusual deviation from his normal work return. Never before had he called out sick, or had he called out sick again since. Simcak had passed away at the age of 79. When his children provided the final DNA sample, it was a match, and the unsolved mystery was finally solved decades later. On May 9, 2018, 42-year-old Ann Thompson, aka Psychic Zoe, of New York, was arrested in a strange but true crime story with an unexpected ending you'll never predict. Charged with grand larceny, scheming to defraud, and for the very act of fortune-telling itself, which is banned in New York, Ann Thompson had very little evidence to defend herself. According to two of her client stories which were later proven true in court, the crimes committed by this fortune-teller were quite bizarre indeed. One of the clients, a woman in her 40s, was told that her relationship problems could only be solved by building a golden pyramid for Ann Thompson. Unless she bought Ann a 9.2 carat diamond ring and other jewelry, her love life was to forever be doomed. Once that problem was solved, the psychic discovered a mysterious curse put on the family that would require even more money to get rid of. By the time Psychic Zoe was through, the woman had spent over $700,000 on phony cures for non-existent problems. The second client in the case, a man from the Midwest, was defrauded with a similar mixture of psychic promises and ominous warnings. According to his story, Ann Thompson said the only true way to get rid of a demonic entity cursing his son was by paying money. He was scammed out of more than $70,000. Only when a private investigator was contacted were the police finally notified. Psychic Zoe and her assistant, Sarah Demetrio, charged only $5 for a reading, but for these two clients the price was a lot higher. In court, Ann Thompson and Sarah Demetrio were put on 5 years of probation in order to pay back $200,000 in restitution, a far cry from the near million that they were accused of taking. Although they are believed to have scammed more than $1 million from 20 different clients between 2013 and 2018. On the afternoon of March 27, 1981, crime scene investigators examined the body of 32-year-old Patricia Beard, who was found in the bed of her first-floor apartment wearing only an open robe. A criminal had gained entry by climbing up a pipe and going through the window before fleeing her Denver, Colorado residence. A full medical examination would later conclude that Patricia couldn't breathe during her final moments on Earth. A crime scene investigator took DNA samples for forensic evidence, and the case went cold for decades. Patricia Beard's true crime mystery is especially dark and disturbing because she was impaired and living in a group home. With a heavily structured lifestyle and no enemies to speak of, investigators agreed that whoever did this was most likely acting out of random malice and did not know her well. In 2012, the Denver District Attorney had made it their mission to get the unsolved cold case solved. Investigators had already solved 99 cold case files and were looking for at least one more to make it 100. While searching the storage room for lost evidence, investigators found a randomly discarded DNA kit with the forensic report from Patricia Beard's case. By this point, almost all of the original evidence from 1981 had been lost except for a single swab test. Since the limited forensic investigation took place in the 80s, all the results said was that the DNA found on Patricia Beard had come from a man, but investigators did not care about the report. It was the kit that attracted their attention, as it still contained the final remaining DNA sample from a swab test. After running the swab test through modernized databases, law enforcement agents matched the DNA found on Patricia to a criminal named Hecker Bencomo Hinojos. He was already serving a prison sentence for a different crime and would not say much to prove this story true, but the criminal did make a confession about living in Denver in 1981. Investigators then turned to his ex-wife, who remembers that when they were living together in Denver, he would sometimes bring home items that she thought were stolen. This occurred around the same time period that Patricia Beard had her life taken. Although the evidence was circumstantial, investigators found it probable that he was breaking into people's houses at the same time as this unsolved case, and could have gotten into Patricia's house at random. When the forensic results came back, investigators say that the test indicates that Hector Bencomo Hinojos was a match with DNA found at the crime scene. He was sentenced to another 48 years behind bars. In December of 1975, concerned relatives of a 19-year-old woman named Lindy Sue Beichler entered her Lancaster, Pennsylvania apartment at 8:46 p.m. They found red stains starting at the front door and continuing into the interior carpet, culminating with Lindy on the floor, a blade still embedded deep inside. Crime scene investigators later determined that the criminal responsible had used a blade from her kitchen 19 times, and at some point had his way with her. Being the 1970s, a full-spectrum DNA analysis was not available at the time, but the evidence was kept in storage to get the cold case solved decades later. In 2019, prosecutors reopened the cold case to find out what had happened to Lindy Sue. They used DNA evidence to create a computer image of what the criminal responsible would look like now. Investigators noted how the skin, hair, and eye colors all matched that of a suspect named David Sinopoli, a man who had lived in the same apartment building as her, and who had moved out shortly before the crime had taken place. In December of 2020, state prosecutors partnered with Parabon Nanolabs Incorporated to perform more in-depth testing. But before they could begin to solve the mystery, they first needed a recent DNA sample from David Sinopoli for genetic comparison. When law enforcement investigators learned that he was booking a flight from Philadelphia International Airport, they followed his trail until he threw away a cup of coffee. This discarded item was recovered from the trash and brought to the lab for more DNA testing. According to prosecutors, when the DNA evidence from the coffee cup was compared to the genetic material found on the crime scene clothing, there was a match. David Sinopoli was arrested and is currently awaiting a criminal trial. If found guilty, then the unsolved mystery regarding what happened to Lindy Sue will be solved once and for all. Should the DNA evidence on the coffee cup prove to be true, the crime story prosecutors are painting will be hard to defend against. On August 14, 1997, the body of a 45-year-old man named Michael Schumeister was found a half-mile from his residence in St. Petersburg, Florida. A crime scene investigation noted how his pockets had been turned inside out, and it looked like during his final moments, he had absorbed a sudden impact to the head from behind. As case investigators traced the man's last known whereabouts, they discovered a strange but true story. He had cashed a check shortly before he was taken out. His wallet was still on his person, but the money was missing. For decades, the strange mystery went unsolved until 2021, when the St. Petersburg Cold Case Unit reopened the files and began rummaging through various pieces of crime scene evidence. Knowing that case detectives were far less knowledgeable about DNA evidence in 1997 than they are now, the Cold Case Unit ordered a pair of pants that Schumeister was wearing to be sent to forensics for testing, using the most recent techniques. The pants contained traces of DNA belonging to a woman named Patricia Morris, then 47 at the time of the crime, and now considerably older. During a police interview in 1997, she admitted to meeting with Michael at a bar on the night that he left this world, but she said the true story was that he had parted ways with her that night. When they tried to find Patricia again, they were to find that she'd met an unexpected ending in 2010. Getting her story for a second time was not needed to prove her criminal guilt, because DNA testing had greatly advanced since 1997. When the results came back, forensic investigators detected large amounts of Patricia's DNA left specifically around the back pockets. She had, without a doubt, gone through the same pockets where he had kept his money. Nearly 20 years later, the unsolved mystery was finally solved. In 1992, 53-year-old John Stagner and his wife Donna were living in Orange County, Florida. On the morning of August 10th, Donna went to wake John after he'd spent the previous evening working as a maintenance worker. When Donna slipped her hands over her husband, she froze. John was cold to the touch. Donna immediately ran for the phone and dialed 911. It looked like someone had taken a walking stick to his head. Forensic investigators searched the crime scene for evidence of the attacker. John and Donna had slept in separate rooms in the summer, as John preferred to sleep without AC, so Donna hadn't seen or heard anything unusual that evening. DNA was taken by forensic investigators, but unfortunately, no matches could be made. The Orange County Sheriff's Office determined that the attacker had entered through the window that John had left open to get some fresh air, and there were no other signs of a break-in or even robbery. Without a DNA match, John's case went cold. Each year, they would gaze over the cold case files, and there was eventually a person of interest, Ronald Cates, who lived close to John and Donna. Ronald was known to borrow tools from John and sell them for money, which John eventually confronted him about. Without enough evidence, the Orange County Sheriff's Office was never able to move forward with a prosecution. The Orange County Sheriff's Office kept a close eye on Ronald Cates and hoped that new evidence would come to light. In April of 2022, the case of John Stagner had an unbelievable and unexpected ending when Ronald Cates made a stunning confession, which saw this decades-old mystery finally solved. While being treated as an inpatient in a North Carolina hospital, Ronald made a criminal confession to a nurse that he had taken a life in 1992. The nurse in question searched for the true story and came across the unsolved cold case of John Stagner. The North Carolina nurse immediately contacted the Orange County Sheriff's Office and reported what Ronald had told her. Finally, after 30 years, the mysterious case had been solved. Ronald Cates was immediately brought in for questioning, where he further confessed to almost everything. Although he told the Orange County Sheriff's Office that he was the one who had taken John's life that night in 1992, he wasn't able to tell officers why. Ronald Cates is expected to be sentenced soon, but unless he makes another confession, the mystery will remain partially unexplained. On March 16, 1993, the Huntington Police Department responded to a call on 4.5 Alley in Huntington, West Virginia. Despite their best attempts, the woman would later pass away in the hospital, and the Huntington Police Department knew they had a homicide case on their hands. After speaking to those in the area, they learned that the victim's name was Lisa Estep, and that she had a reputation of doing street work in an alley. Weeks later, they discovered that the woman's real name was Melissa Martinez. Her friends and family asked the police and the media to withhold her name, and the investigation continued. In 2021, 59-year-old Ricky Louis Wood was arrested in Billings, Montana, on an unrelated charge when he made a shocking confession. At first, he told Billings investigators that he had information about the 1993 case of Lisa. But as the interview went on, he slowly confessed to being the person responsible. Investigators in Billings contacted the Huntington Police Department and told them everything that Ricky had told them. Ricky was also interviewed by the Huntington Police Department, and under questioning, he told them everything they'd been waiting to hear. Ricky Wood was officially charged with Lisa's case in October of 2022, and is currently waiting for extradition from Montana to West Virginia to face justice. To support 4 children, 30-year-old Sherry Herrera of Tulare, California, often traveled up and down various truck stops each night looking for customers. In March of 1993, Sherry would mysteriously disappear. Sherry's case would have an unbelievable moment when her case was connected to another in Texas from the year before. On March 30th, 1993, Sherry's body was discovered on the side of I-10 near the California-Arizona state line. She had been dumped on a ramp and left in clear view of the oncoming traffic. Little could be done with the DNA evidence that was found. In 1993, DNA was in its infancy, and investigators struggled to find a match to the DNA left behind at the crime scene. What investigators didn't know was that the person responsible for what had happened to Sherry was also responsible for a similar crime just 100 miles away. In 2002, the DNA profile discovered on Sherry was uploaded to CODIS, and that's when investigators linked the two cases. In 1992, the body of Shenda Denise Hayes had been discovered at the side of I-30 near Dallas, Texas. At first, investigators hadn't linked the two cases together, but thanks to forensic evidence, they now knew that the cases were linked by a common attacker. It would take another 18 years before investigators in each state could make the breakthrough that was needed. In June of 2022, using the results of a genetic genealogy test, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office announced that 67-year-old Douglas Thomas had been arrested in connection with the case of Sherry Herrera and Shenda Hayes. According to investigators, Douglas had lived with his family in Waco, Texas, and had worked as a trucker for almost 40 years. It was at these truck stops that investigators believed he met Sherry and Shenda. If it hadn't been for advances in DNA technologies, Douglas may have gotten away with the crime. Douglas is facing charges in both Texas and California. 72-year-old Claire K. Holman of California was a hairdresser who met an unexpected ending at the hands of an unknown assailant. In 1994, Claire's true crime case would go cold for decades. On March 21, 1994, Claire's body was found at her home on Tilting T Drive in Borrego Springs. Her family hadn't heard from her in a while, and she wasn't picking up the phone, prompting them to visit. When they ventured inside, they found her body along with a piece of cord or rope that had been used to attack her. Unknown male DNA was recovered from the scene, but it wasn't until 2003 that this evidence was properly processed and run through CODIS. By 2021, the case had run cold, but investigators decided to try one new approach: genetic genealogy. The unknown male DNA recovered from the scene was sent for a fresh analysis, and this time the forensic scientists at the lab were able to come up with a match. After decades of waiting, the DNA at the crime scene was determined to have belonged to Jerry Dwayne Robinson, who had lived in Borrego Springs at the time of the crime. Jerry Dwayne Robinson had passed away in 2007, but investigators were now happy that Claire's case could finally be put to bed once and for all. In 1979, Uicha Mulgari of Korea and Helga Deschamps of Germany moved to Fort Ord, California, with their husbands who were serving at the US military base in California. The two lived across the street from one another, with Uicha living at 205 Koski Drive and Helga at 204 Koski Drive. In October of 1979, Uicha's husband returned home at dinner time to find his wife in the home unresponsive. Just hours earlier, she had kissed her husband goodbye, and now she was gone. The entire base was shocked by the senseless crime, and her husband became the first suspect. 15 days later, across the road from where Uicha was found, Helga Deschamps was also found by her husband after a long day of duty. The military husbands were considered persons of interest. However, both of them had an alibi, and the cases quickly went cold. Aside from the husbands, there was only one other person of interest, Jern Norris, who lived close to Fort Ord. According to reports, at the time of the crimes, Jern's wife was serving at Fort Ord, giving him access to the base. Whilst Jern was considered a person of interest, the Marina Police Department did not have enough evidence to move forward with a conviction, and the case went cold. For decades, the only person of interest in the case was Jern, but without any evidence, he was allowed to live as a free man. That was until November of 2022, when new DNA evidence came to light, and thanks to the hard work of forensic scientists, the Marina Police Department was able to link Jern Norris to both of the 1975 crime scenes. Jern is also a suspect in a similar crime that occurred in Fort Worth, Texas, and he will possibly stand trial in Texas before being extradited to California to face additional charges. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.